a sports with trans athletes, that is a sporting world that I'm more interested in.
So if you're a woman and you don't take any extra hormones or male hormones, you're not taking steroids or any sort of performance enhancing drugs, but then someone comes along that was a man for 30 years and decides that they're going to be a woman, and this has happened, it's not fair. It's as much cheating as taking steroids when the other person doesn't.
I disagree, and
what do you disagree about?
I've already, well, I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfectly level playing field. I think we decide what kind of playing field we want to have.
Ever wonder why Joe Rogan's podcast blows up Twitter every other week? It's not just his charm. It's because he's not afraid to call out BS when he sees it. In this video, we're diving into the moments when Rogan goes head-to-head with guests, pushing woke agendas. You'll see him shut down arguments faster than you can say triggered. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Joe Rogan's not your average podcast host. He has this uncanny ability to spot BS from a mile away, and boy does he need it when it comes to dealing with the whole woke culture thing. You've probably noticed how this woke stuff is spreading like wildfire in the media these days. It's like everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing, but not Joe. He's the guy who's gonna ask the questions nobody else dares to. I take for instance the time a guest on his show tried to push the crazy idea.
Reports from the front lines of kids in high school today, that word gets out the window. That word retard comes flying out of these kids' mouths. They're bringing that back strong.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, and I know that because, but the youngest one was in a complete fire zone of this woke culture.
Because he works harder at sport.
Yeah.
That's what you get from a lot of people that work hard at sports, people that value hard work. And people that value hard work tend to be more conservative.
Can you believe Joe wasn't having any of it? He fired back saying, if the child thinks it's a girl, let it be a girl. You don't have to give them hormones. Boom. Simple logic, right? But it's not just about kids and hormones. Joe's taking on all sorts of woke nonsense. Remember when everyone was losing their minds over cultural appropriation? Joe called it out for what it is. Culturally appropriating is one of the dumbest things. Cities are melting pots of awesome culture. He's not afraid to say what we're all thinking. And here's the kicker. Joe's not doing this just to be controversial. He genuinely believes that all this woke talk is backfiring. He once said, "You're making more Republicans with this crazy talk." Think about that for a second. The very people pushing this stuff might be driving folks in the opposite direction. But what happens when Joe starts poking holes in these arguments? It's like watching a house of cards collapse. These guests come in thinking they've got it all figured out, and Joe just starts asking simple questions. Before you know it, they're tripping over their own logic. It's almost funny to watch, but there's a serious side to it too. Joe's exposed how a lot of this woke culture stuff is just absurd when you really break it down. He's got this theory about where it all comes from. He says the whole woke culture thing is driven by people who felt like they were pushed around, and now they want to turn it on you. It's like they've gone from being bullied to being the bullies.
I'm asking you to distance yourself from that is actually what I'm trying to do.
But that's not what you're doing, though. You're associating him with that, clearly. This sort of race science is outdated and long since debunked, especially given the strong links between Atlantis and Aryans proposed by several Nazi archaeologists. That's like a part of the headline. We're talking about you.
Yes, but what I'm trying to say is that people misinterpret Graham. There's lots of people on the internet that think that he's talking about a lost white civilization.
Right, but this is something that you chose to highlight at the top of the page.
Hollywood stars are used to adoring fans and softball interviews, but on Joe Rogan's podcast, it's a whole different ballgame. Ever wonder what happens when those picture-perfect celebrities have to defend their woke stances without a script? Spoiler alert, it ain't pretty. You might think Joe is just another Hollywood celeb, but you'd be dead wrong. While Tinseltown's finest are busy virtue signaling on Twitter, Rogan's calling out their BS right to their faces. It's like watching David take on Goliath, except David's got a podcast and Goliath's got a publicist. See, most celebs are used to spouting off about social issues without anyone questioning them. They post a black square on Instagram, change their profile pic for Pride Month, and boom, they're activists. But Joe...
Choosing to add hormones to a child's body, that's a choice. An actual woman. Yeah, I said actual. off.
Gender's not just genitals, it's in your mind.
Right. So you think that males should be able to compete in the women's division of weightlifting?
No, I don't necessarily.
But they can if they transition.
If someone is, transitioning from the age of 7 years old, right? And working with those hormones, from that age, right? They're not going to have, their body situation is going to be very different than the one that you postulated, right?
There's no reason to give kids hormones, and there's no reason to decide before a person's frontal lobe is completely fully developed, which doesn't even take place till 25.
He wants more than just hashtags and hollow gestures. When a celebrity steps into Rogan's arena, they're in for a rude awakening. He doesn't care about their millions of followers or their latest box office hit. He cares about facts. And when he starts poking holes in their woke arguments, things get real uncomfortable real fast. Remember when Joe talked to Greg Fitzsimmons about cultural appropriation? He didn't mince words. He said, culturally appropriating is one of the dumbest things. Cities are melting pots of awesome cultures, and they all get together. That ruffled some Hollywood feathers, but here's the thing. When celebs get cornered, they often resort to emotional arguments. They'll talk about how they feel or how something is problematic without any real substance. Joe's not buying it. He wants hard facts, not feelings. And when these stars can't back up their claims, that's when things get interesting. Some try to change the subject, others get defensive, and a few have even stormed off the show. But Joe, he stays cool as a cucumber, letting their reactions speak for themselves. Joe? It's not just about exposing individual celebs, though. Joe's taking on the whole culture of Hollywood hypocrisy. He's showing how these stars preach one thing and practice another. They talk about equality while living in gated communities. They preach about climate change while flying private jets. So, how do these encounters usually end? With the celeb's carefully crafted image in tatters, and Joe's audience seeing behind the curtain. It's like the Emperor's New Clothes, but with more tattoos and DMT references. Joe's no-nonsense approach is doing more than just entertaining us. It's exposing the hollow core of woke culture in Hollywood. He's showing that when you scratch the surface of all that virtue signaling, there's often not much substance underneath. Forget Hollywood, let's talk academia. You think a guy who calls himself would get schooled by professors? Wrong. Joe's about to flip the script on some of the biggest brains in the business, and trust me, it ain't pretty for the PhDs. Now, you might expect university professors to run circles around a comedian, but when they step into Joe's arena, they're in for a rude awakening. These academic hotshots come on the show thinking they can push their fancy theories without anyone calling them out. Big mistake. Joe's got this knack for using simple logic to poke holes in complex academic arguments. It's like watching a kid with a slingshot take down Goliath. These professors are used to hiding behind big words and complicated theories. But Joe? He cuts right through all that noise. Remember that time a gender studies professor couldn't even define what a woman is? It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. The professor kept trying to dodge the question, throwing out buzzwords left and right, but Joe wouldn't let up. He just kept asking, "What's a woman?" over and over. By the end, that professor's credibility was in tatters. That's the thing about Joe. He's not afraid to say that doesn't make sense, even to someone with a PhD. He doesn't care about your fancy degrees or how many books you've written. If something sounds like BS, he's going to call it out. Joe's takedown of Graham Hancock's critics is another prime example. He pointed out how the academic community often dismisses valid evidence because of their own biases. Joe said they dismissed him, and publicly they still did all those things that you're trying to office. He's not afraid to challenge the ivory tower mentality. Even when it comes to hot-button issues like cultural appropriation, Joe's not backing down. In a chat with Greg Fitzsimmons, he said, "Culturally appropriating is one of the dumbest things, because that's what cities are. They're melting pots of awesome cultures." He's calling out how some academic ideas just don't hold up in the real world. So what happens when these highfalutin academic theories meet Joe's real-world common sense? It's like watching a house of cards collapse. These professors are used to lecturing students who just nod along, but Joe? He asks the questions no one else dares to. He makes them defend their ideas in plain English. And that's where Joe's power lies. His straightforward logic cuts through all the academic jargon and buzzwords. In his title Musings, he shows that sometimes a little common sense goes a lot further than a framed degree on the wall. So, you think Joe's got a knack for exposing BS in ivory towers? Hold up, there's more to this story than just making smart people look dumb. What if I told you Joe's real fight isn't against professors, but against something that affects every single one of us? Something that's slowly chipping away at the core of our society in a world where people get canceled for saying the wrong thing? Joe Rogan's podcast is like the last place where you can actually talk about stuff without walking on eggshells. His show isn't just about interviewing celebs or making jokes. It's about having real conversations about things that matter, even if they're controversial. Joe's not afraid to touch topics that most people run away from. He'll talk about politics, gender issues, drugs, you name it, and he doesn't just bring on people he agrees with. He'll sit down with anyone, from far-right conservatives to hardcore leftists. Why? Because he thinks hearing different ideas is important. But not everyone's happy about this. Some people have tried to shut Joe down. Remember when CNN said he was taking horse medicine for COVID? Joe fired back saying, "Do I have to sue CNN? CNN is saying I'm taking horsey wormer. I literally got it from a doctor." It was like they were trying to make him look stupid just because they didn't like what he was saying. Joe's not backing down, though. He believes in this thing called the marketplace of ideas. It's pretty simple. Let all the ideas out there, and the good ones will rise to the top. Maybe he once said, "I think that the best way to deal with ideas you don't like is to talk about them." Makes sense, right? Instead of trying to silence, why not just have a conversation? But here's where it gets really interesting. Joe's show isn't just entertainment. It's actually changing how people think and talk about important stuff. Millions of people tune into each episode. That's a lot of ears hearing ideas they might not get anywhere else. And it's not just about the big issues. Joe's approach is teaching people that it's okay to ask questions, to challenge things that don't make sense. That's ignorance. It's showing that you don't have to be an expert to have a thoughtful opinion. You just need to be willing to listen and think critically. So what's the real impact of all this? Well, Joe's basically become a champion for free speech. In a time when a lot of people feel like they can't say what they really think, he's proving that there's still an audience for honest, open conversations. And he's doing it without trying to please everyone or stick to some approved list of topics. In the end, Joe Rogan's not just defending free speech, he's challenging this whole culture of canceling people for having the wrong opinions. He's showing that maybe, just maybe, we'd all be better off if we talk to each other instead of shouting each other down. So, what do you think? Is Joe onto something here? Or is he just stirring up trouble? Either way, one thing's for sure. He's got people talking. And in a world where everyone's trying to shut each other up, that might be the most important thing of